the DWP uses the threat of welfare fraud as a get-out-of-jail-free card to operate in secret, but with machine learning tools allowing for human-like profiling on a large scale, more scrutiny is really needed and not less.
Welcome to another episode of Compromising Positions. Jeff, what have you got for us today?
Well, today we're diving into a story that on the surface is about the government's use of algorithms to flag welfare claimants for fraud. But at its core, the episode is about something much broader, something that every security professional, technologist and privacy advocate should care about. And that's what happens when you design systems that don't trust the people they're meant to serve. So I'm calling this episode Suspicion by Design because it gets to the heart of how risk modeling, automation and profiling are increasingly embedded into our systems, from things like the public sector to also private sector platforms we use every day. Also because it's actually the title of the paper we've been reviewing, but so there's that, but it's a great title. So if you work in security, I think you already know the balance between protecting a system and respecting the users is delicate. But what happens if the systems we're building or auditing quite criminalize people by default? What if fraud detection becomes overreach? And what if privacy is treated as kind of a loophole?
And I think more than just security people, I mean, as citizens of the UK, we probably need to know about this as well, because I think the full title is what we know about the DWP's algorithmic black box and what it tries to hide, which sounds pretty scary. So this is by Big Brother Watch, isn't it?
Yeah, and for the people, listeners, both inside and outside the UK, so inside the UK you might have heard of them, outside probably not, because they're a UK-based civil liberties group, and they've produced some really noticeable and quite shocking investigations, usually grounded in official data from things like Freedom of Information Act requests, which is how you can get access to the data we should have access to, frankly, and some of its high-profile reports. There's one they did in 2018 on Metropolitan Police's facial recognition system being 98% inaccurate. And they get widely cited by the mainstream media and acknowledged by authorities because they've actually got a very good reputation and actually have worked on several high-profile court cases as well against the government bodies, and one which is quite startling.
But with a name like Big Brother Watch, it kind of sounds a bit like it might be like a conspiracy theory group. But because I remember when I first came across them, I was like, oh, is this a reputable source? But it turns out it genuinely is.
Yeah. So there was a little bit of, so they were founded by a libertarian group, members from the House of Lords, and their funding was initially a little bit opaque. So it did come across as maybe they had an agenda, but over time they've grown into how can they make themselves agendaless and transparent and basically politically non-aligned as possible. And I think they've got to that point now a good few years on, where despite their name, I think their name, it doesn't necessarily do them any favors. They're very well respected.
Of course, it's, to do with Orwell's 1984, which, this paper plays really nicely in, but I've used them as well in the past for my own talks and research. One of my favorite pieces that they did a few years back, about a year or two back, was on surveillance, but in terms of AI surveillance with things like Bossware, but they've also done things on the digital advertising boards, the big billboards that you see that are all sort of electronic, and how they actually follow you around the city and steal loads of data, like your dwell time, so how long you're looking at the billboards for, and determining things like your age, your sex, your mood, and things like that. Lots of creepy surveillance stuff. So they are doing excellent work here. So a great paper you've picked. So this is their more recent one, isn't it? So it came out July this year.
Yeah, it's pretty recent. They've put a couple of really interesting papers out recently, actually. This paper, published on the 9th of July 2025, looks at several different DWP systems, some of which are AI based, some of which are just more traditional data analytics automation. So the first one is the Advances model, which is, I think, the sort of the one they lead with more. And there's some pilot machine learning tools. And also then they take some lessons from historic FOI requests about DWP algorithms, things like RIS and IRIS, something called Advances mode, which is about advances on universal credit and future modelling, and remarks.
Universal credit, just for our listeners who will be abroad, universal credit is our main way people receive benefits in the UK at the moment. It's a relatively new system. It's replaced quite a lot of other benefits and kind of bundled them all in together because it just kind of make people aware.
Yeah, and then the end, basically, with a bunch of there's some commonality between all of the I wouldn't say failings necessarily, but things where they've found it to be wanting, and a bunch of recommendations, which is kind of what they do in a lot of their papers, because they're in a position where they understand data well enough now, because they've been around for a long time, that they can actually make reasonably impartial and robust recommendations on how data and privacy should be handled. This paper discusses it leads with one in particular, but it discusses several DWP projects, and for those maybe not in the know, that's the Department of Work and Pensions, not the Department of Work Prevention. That would be the security team. So some of these projects are AI based, which is, I think, where some of the consternation is coming from, and some are more traditional data processing based. However, the sort of the lead project in this paper is claimed, and looks reasonable, I think this claim, it's probably the biggest AI deployment by the UK government today, which in itself is kind of interesting because the UK government, although we're all in on AI, we haven't done a lot of high profile deployments. And in this case, because the Department of Work and Pensions also looks into how people get their benefits paid and things like that, the stuff that they're entitled to under our system, the consequences of getting it wrong are catastrophic. Basically, the decisions made by the DWP, and this is a quote from the paper, impact those who can least afford for it to be wrong.
Yeah, and that, as you say, has such devastating consequences for people. But what I want to say at the top of the episode is, while we were going to be talking about this paper in relation to the DWP, this is not to have a dig at anyone who works in the DWP at the moment. A lot of good friends of ours work in the sort of tech area of the DWP, so no slight on you or anything like that. We just want to kind of discuss what this paper has found because we thought it was interesting. Also, let's not in the comments or anything like that get into any kind of discussion about who deserves to be on benefits and benefit fraud in terms of the sort of political elements of it, which people can get a bit riled up for, and things like that. So let's kind of keep it non-judgmental in that form, and if we come to this with like an open mind, dear listeners.
I don't think in their findings the DWP have necessarily done much wrong. It's mainly focusing around the processes and the lack of transparency and the potential for harm. In some cases there have been harms, but really this is kind of a rallying call to the UK public sector, and this should be for, I think, for everybody, to make sure when you're automating decisioning is to make sure it's as transparent as possible. Because there have been some automations, AI and automation, that have kind of not gone very well for the UK. There was a sham marriage screening algorithm that was highly inaccurate, and there's questions around whether or not, without some serious external oversight, whereas the current government departments should be trusted to launch things where the risks, the stakes are very, very high without some kind of proper external oversight. And the paper found actually that transparency and scrutiny around high stakes AI are really important, but what they're getting instead is kind of a lot of opacity, because this is not a chatbot. This is not something that tells you, calculates where the weather's going to be or anything like this. This is something that could potentially change payments for people who are not very financially well off. Now, one of the arguments made in the paper when there was pushback against the transparency is it'd enable malign actors to game the system, basically kind of equivalent to there's no security through obscurity. So I guess one thing to ask you actually, Leanne, is because basically you've got to submit to their processes and their algorithmic data processing for an access to state resources, to state support. Is that ethical?
Ethical is an interesting question, but what does it... Because it's part of the social contract that we are all kind of in agreement of, and the social contract is basically the agreement that we have with positions of power, so things like the state. In olden times, it would have been the church and the royal family, and things like that. And what we do is we give up some of our rights in order to have other rights in return, which is basically the state will look after you, for example, if you're sick, we'll give you a safety net and things like that. However, there is a lot to be said nowadays, and there has been a lot of criticism that social contract where, we all be good little girls and boys and contribute to the state and don't cause chaos in exchange for the state looking after us has been eroded. And what that kind of insinuates is the social contract still valid? Is there's still a lot to be gleaned from engaging with a system that doesn't seem to look after you anymore? I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about pensions, for example, particularly if you are not of pension age and whether or not you will actually even have a pension, because the pension age keeps going up and things like that, and more reliance on you to basically look after yourself. And also, not to get too political either, but things like the NHS, people relying on being able to use the NHS, but with wait times and services being cut and underfunded, that leads to a lot of questions about people, do they want to continue to contribute to a state that doesn't seem to be looking after themselves anymore, looking after them as much?
And I guess also it leads into what we talk about in one of our other talks about also the new social contract, that we give up our privacy and data in order to participate in the now increasing the online world. And I guess it sort of loops back to the question is, if this is a support service, something that is required, this is not Facebook, this is not Instagram, this is, I need to be able to heat my house and feed my children. I guess, is it ethical?
Yeah, and it puts the question of technology as the enforcer, where suspicion is the default, which is obviously not something you want to participate in, because then you are getting into Orwellian territory, as Big Brother Watch's namesake indicates. But there's also the whole thing of there is no such thing as refusal in this system, because if you refuse, then you don't get access to it. And when you've got a situation like that, when you ask, is it ethical? It's more that it undermines trust, which then kind of leads to ethical grey areas, because you can't opt out of this. If you need that money, and if you've contributed to that pot, if you've paid your national insurance to be able to claim this money eventually, then you should be able to have at least an understanding of what you're getting into when you start engaging with things like the universal credit system. If they are, as this report claims to be, using data profiling, they have, I think in their paper, have a really interesting description for it, don't they? They call it monstrous suspicion architecture, which is interesting. What do you think of that term, Jeff?
I think suspicion architecture, I mean, again, with their title, it's maybe over-egging. I think they take a slightly pessimistic view on the world, but I think they need to make sure that that pessimistic reality of the world doesn't happen. For example, part of that monstrous suspicion architecture is they can't check, as part of these new checks, they can't check everybody's financial details properly. So, and the banks can't do it manually. So the banks have been obligated to use automation to, on demand of the DWP, scan accounts, dragging actually private sector into this monstrous suspicion architecture. And I guess how much further will that progress?
Well, there's a big thing, isn't there, at the moment, where the UK government, I think there's a upcoming another Big Brother Watch white paper coming out about how they did a blog post about it recently, at least. The banking system speaking to things like HMRC and things, when asked upon, like, let's look into people's bank accounts and see actually what is their financial situation for real, and sharing that information, which initially started out a few years back. There was a big campaign for banks to share information amongst each other, with the idea of making it easier for the consumer to be able to get better deals, supposedly, with different banks if they just share details amongst each other. But you can almost see that might have been a precursor to something like this, getting us used to the idea of banks sharing amongst themselves and eventually sharing amongst the government.
Yeah, but I mean, crucially, that one was an opt-in, and Payment Services Directive 2, I believe, just from my own casual inference, followed the model of NHS England, where they're looking at how to get better integration between healthcare services. All the principles are pretty much the same. And in every case, it's putting the power or it should be putting the power in the hands of the consumer. So consumers get better deals because they choose to use different providers to link these things up and use different apps to bust their information around. Whereas this is the other way around, although I imagine you have to consent to your bank account being scanned for automated profiling purposes. It's not really probably quite the same thing. But yes, I think having all of these banking APIs opened up and having banking information opened up to this kind of thing, if you're more suspicious minded, then maybe it could lead to more sinister use cases. And one of the other complaints I think about this process was that the DWP published their data privacy impact assessment and then just went, oh, look, here's our impact assessment. It's fine. First of all, it doesn't tell you a lot about what the processing entails. And secondly, if you interpret it a certain way, actually, the risk profile is pretty high. The risk profile of what they're doing with that data is actually 4 out of 5 in severity, which should mean there's a lot of care taken with it.
So we've got a system here that Big Brother Watch suggests is suspicious by design. It presupposes guilt, at least a high propensity for it, and it's often part of a population that are in more precarious situations. We can go into, I think it does go into profiling on there, and it's also supposedly one of the most widespread deployments of AI and algorithmic powered tools by the British government, especially in terms of people affected. And I've just had a quick Google. There are 7.5 million people on universal credit at the moment. So that is a huge population. So they've gone through rights as well. So that obviously the DWP have had to kind of do a risk impact assessment. So when Big Brother Watch has asked for freedom of information requests on this, they found it quite shocking, you say. So 4 out of 5 sounds quite high. Is that normal?
Well, I wouldn't say it's normal. And also, they redacted a lot of stuff. So and despite repeated requests to have further redactions relaxed, this is not the case. The other part of this that was very worrying, and I think there's a reason why the risk profile is so high, is although they don't record protected characteristics for reasons, of legalities, or they're not using, or if they do have them recorded, they're not using them for training and inference of the AI models, they're effectively doing it by proxy. So things like reported illnesses, that, disability is a protected characteristic. Reported illness is not. But from a reported illness, you can infer if somebody might be disabled.
Right. So they're making the assumption if you have a reported illness, then you have a high potential to be
depending
disabled.
on what the reported illness is and your age bracket, and also things like whether or not you're living with somebody to guess whether or not you're married
or cohabiting as a couple, or so it's kind of like profiling then.
Basically, they're trying to infer, or maybe that's too strong, but the model we call this in AI redundant markers, where basically even if you don't have, we'll say there's an area of the country that has a particular racial bunching. If you don't record ethnicity, but if you record the full postcode, and you can basically then effectively almost just infer things. And even if you don't do it on purpose, sometimes that's kind of what the outcome that happens is you end up with this bias built in that's basically built on a protected characteristic without ever directly using that protected characteristic, which is why you need really good AI people in your team to figure out how to do that.
I was going to say, isn't that quite dodgy, isn't it? It's like, you're bunching a load of people into different groups, stereotyping people kind of to the extreme, and sort of saying, if you're in this group, then it looks like, I guess, playing on what they've got access to, which is disability. I think one of the characteristics was if they're self-employed or not, and cohabitation sort of levels and things like that, and nationality, sort of suggesting that if you're part of any of these groups, if there's a 1 or a 0 in one of those columns, then you're more likely to commit benefit fraud.
I think it's even kind of worse than that. It's more like they're saying that malign actors may claim to fit in those categories, so they could claim to be disabled, trying to
kind of cloaking themselves.
Yeah. But that means that then basically, if you are actually genuinely disabled, then you might fit into this kind of profiling of like, oh, this might be just because people will go after the stuff where there's more likely to be a higher payment or more likely to be a payment, which is really problematic. Sometimes, from the data, it's difficult to tell whether or not somebody is pretending to. Then you have to go into much deeper investigation to actually prove that, which then becomes like really invasive.
And so if you you make a claim, for example, universal credit, and then you go through the system, and then for whatever reason the algorithm flags you as a potential fraud risk, what happens then?
And this is where I think there's an interesting tale for thinking about how you actually implement your own systems. Is it's not just that particular claim that is stopped. All claims are stopped pending the investigation, which if you have no money coming in and that investigation takes a reasonable amount of time and is very stressful, that could be disastrous. That could mean, especially if that's in the winter and you can't afford to have your heating on or something like that. And this could cause people to lose their lives in theory. That's an extreme outcome, but I don't think it's one that is out of the realms of possibility. So the struggle with it is when you get flagged up, then suddenly the world stops for you, and when you need it the most.
So how do DWP sort of rectify this? So you've been flagged as fraud. I'm guessing they do more than just stop your claim. They must let you know that you're being that the AI algorithm. Do they say that the AI algorithm has blocked your claim for more investigation?
I'm not sure if they say AI algorithm, but they say this process has, and we're looking at multiple different processes and systems over this period of this paper. So some of these may blend together, and I'm not up on all of the internal DWP systems, so take it with a pinch of salt. But basically, you basically get an auditing letter, I think, and then you have to comply. You basically told you've got to comply with this, or it's going to get really difficult for you.
What's compliance?
And that is turning over months worth of banking statements or access to your bank accounts, PayPal accounts, basically anywhere where money could move, like phone records. I think there's quite a lot of invasive stuff you have to hand over. But the reason for selection is quite opaque. You just get said you've been selected. It doesn't say why. So the outcome of that is that people feel them not only are they stressful and invasive, they feel arbitrary.
Right. Okay. So not really sort of given any kind of information as to why they've been selected or anything like that. It's just you have been selected for more checks, send in some bank statements, things like that.
Sometimes even an actual, you get called in for an interview too, which is apparently very stressful as well.
I thought GDPR didn't allow things like this in terms of automated decision making.
Oh, I think if you undergo automation decision making, you have every right to ask for for the explainability of that. You need to know step by step why it came to that conclusion. However, the DWP argues that this is not an automated decision. It is a flag.
It sounds like an automated decision. It sounds like based on some data, potentially, according to this paper, biased data, although at least they can't prove it. Also, on top of it, it sounds like there's like a load of lack of informed consent, which is another kind of GDPR red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is where, unfortunately, the GDPR and its equivalent, because the UK isn't part of GDPR anymore, we have an equivalency that's good enough. I think it's almost the same thing. Is a standard that's written in a human language, in a natural language, and those not being formal language for people who do computer science, like formal languages, mathematicians, it's open to interpretation. So it's flagging something for a human review of automated decisioning or not. You can make an argument either way. But since the payments will stop until they comply, I don't know. I'd say that fits more on the side of decisioning. They've decided to stop processing your money and claim all claims until you comply, which feels like a decision to me. But the courts so far haven't taken the side of the customer on this.
Yeah, and from what I can read in the paper, just kind of scrolling through, DWP are really resolute in saying it's, there's definitely a human in the loop. So, so it looks like to me the process is individual sends off a claim. I used to work in helping people make benefits claims and things like that. This process is already very lengthy. It really is. It takes a lot of time and emotional strain and stress. So I can imagine it's still this was a few years ago, 2017, but I can imagine it's still just as lengthy. Take a load of details from you, you send it off, and your fingers crossed that you'll get some money because maybe you haven't had your heating on in a few days, and maybe you are going to food banks and things like that. So you're quite desperate for money. And so it goes off, and then for whatever reason, whatever you put on that form, it's flagged it, and now you're being reviewed. And then I guess, you don't get told why, but you just get asked for more information. But then at some point on their side, by looking at what Big Brother Watch has laid out, DWP a human being will turn around and say, okay, this has been flagged, we're going to do more checks. And this is where they're claiming there's a human in the loop to kind of prevent that from happening. But throughout that, like what I can see on the paper is it says here that people are not aware that they've been subjected to profiling or how that data is being processed using artificial intelligence. So that's interesting. And there's also a big thing around data retention. It says here that because the data needs to be retained for longer than standard.
Well, it gets worse, doesn't it? It's because they're now training the largest AI rollout in the UK potentially. Is they use that data for training as well. And once the data is in the model, there's a problem with data retention because it's very hard to unpick, unless you build the model, it's very hard to unpick data out of a machine learning model. But attackers can actually use attacks, things like membership inference attacks to actually pull, or other attacks to actually pull the data out of the model potentially. So once your data is in there and it's in training sets, sometimes it's not just a matter of we have your data for processing purposes or do you keep a customer record. It's actually kind of worse than that. And I think this is going to be a hurdle that the private sector are going to have to get over as well. Is that data retention problem, and that is actually a privacy thing. If somebody can come along and run a model inversion attack or a model theft attack or a membership inference attack, that means that your data that they no longer had the right to process or keep hold of is lost, which is kind of scary.
I guess the argument that I can almost hear people shouting, and a little bit of me is shouting itself, isn't this needed to prevent fraud? If you were to look at any of the tabloids, newspapers, you'd think that fraud is incredibly prevalent, and we need to claw back as much money as possible. So this system, this algorithmic system might not be perfect by any stretch of the means, and yes, it's not transparent, but isn't it a good thing that we're doing this to kind of claw back some money?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two sides to it. They're claiming it'll save billions over the decade or so that it's been running, and whether or not we can go over the economics of it, because we've done over that, and it's it probably does make some money. But I think so. You hinted at there is we need to make it like an unappealing target, because otherwise, one thing if we didn't do it, then people would. If we had no fraud checks, then people would just walk in and take all the money. And we're not saying that maybe people who claim credit are stealing money. It's more like the system would be attacked if there weren't sufficient defenses on it. That money would probably then be taken off to organised crime somewhere else. But the problem is, I think the problematic part is that 80% of people who have been checked by this invasive process have done nothing wrong and have no changes made to their universal credit. Now, if you think
that seems like a very high false positive rate.
Exactly, it's just a bit too high, isn't it? And it's not.
Has no one said maybe this algorithm isn't working very well. That's higher than a lot of hallucinations that
It's
these
bad.
models are doing.
It's really bad. And of course, and then the other thing is, as of those 20%, it doesn't say how many of those are actually fraudulent or just inaccurate. So maybe you go, actually, no, we got it wrong. We'll just adjust your universal credit a bit. So that some of that 20% is that. And then there is unmarked percentage actual fraud. So then when you think about, well, how much of that fraud versus the cost of all of this, because a lot of this is outsourced as well. They're having to hire thousands of people to cover the checks in these systems and outsourcing it to other countries as well, which is interesting. Other countries in the EU, but still interesting that we're doing some of our incredibly sensitive data processing with external contractors, which doesn't feel very comfortable to me.
And it's precisely that sensitivity that they keep claiming, which is why the freedom of information request that Big Brother Watch asked for was so heavily redacted, isn't it? They make reference that DWP suggested that if we tell you what coding languages we use and on how we make these decisions, then people will game the system for fraudulent reasons. They'll know exactly how to commit fraud and things like that. What do you think of that argument?
I think that argument is made by somebody who doesn't understand programming language. Imagine if I could just walk up to Barclays and say, what programming language you use? And they say, Python. Cool, I've hacked your system, bro. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, as I say, we've got friends who work in DWP and they do a fantastic job, I should say. Just go ask them, go look on LinkedIn and see what their developers are working on. So it's like, well, we're not here to advertise, but
No, I mean, you look at what they're hiring for.
Well, yeah, exactly. It'd just be easy to find that, but to be like, no, blanket no, not letting. The reason why this document is so redacted is because people will use it against us, which it kind of goes against at least my understanding of what some of these algorithmic protections are supposed to do. Was, I know that algorithms by their very nature tend to be black box, which makes it harder for us as human beings to understand and us working with it to understand. But what they do know, they're not sharing.
Yeah. And I think...
And they're treating it like it's proprietary information, like you would if you were a company and you didn't want to share intellectual property. I think when it comes to citizens of a country and knowing that there is a system that they have to opt into if they want any ability to support themselves and not be able to question that brings up some very ethical grey areas there and a lot of questions around power dynamics and who has the ability to have any kind of autonomy as they go through life, being able to sort of question the authority around them. We're lucky we're in a democratic society at the moment, but if something changes, continuing to have these discussions where we can't question why we're being penalised by a state that's supposed to protect us is very interesting as a discussion, as a philosophical discussion.
Yeah, I think there's even a simpler one. Is like there's a long-held security principle. There is no security through obscurity, because if your security relies on somebody not knowing something entirely, I mean, not talking about passwords here, but like not knowing what programming language you're using, like that's not good security. That means that somebody at some point will find out that. So I imagine at some point, if they're so worried about the algorithms because the algorithm's weak, and if it's so inaccurate and they're so afraid, I'd be more inclined to believe that it's so weak and inaccurate that eventually people will find the way around it. And what will happen is, because there's not enough scrutiny on it, and this is where I think that actually the opposite of obscurity, you're putting something in the open means there's more eyes on it, and that means more quality on it. It's like things like cryptography when it's out in the open. It means more eyes get on it, and that means actually it gets better. And I'm worried that people will get in the system because if it's too weak and inaccurate, somebody will find out what the secret magic combination is, what the cheat code is, and they'll just walk around it, and they'll will game the system, which I think is problematic, and it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the quotes I find interesting on this report, so it says, in the judgment, Big Brother Watch sort of suggested that the model that they're using might be biased. Baroness Hale of Richmond wrote, the whole point of the law is to require suppliers to treat each person as an individual, not as a member of a group. The individual should not be assumed to hold the characteristics which the supplier associates with the group, whether or not most members of the group do indeed have such characteristics. So that's the criticism of the argument of, social profiling against people, and which the paper goes on to suggest, the complete absence of transparency about what personal data is being used and how it acts as a significant block for people who want to understand how they're being profiled by the DWP. And it says, whether disparities within the model are improving, as it stands, the public cannot learn about how this widely deployed model could be used to discriminate against them. So it's all pretty kind of scary stuff,
Yeah.
this. I don't want to suggest in any way, shape, or form that the intention of the universal credit system is to disadvantage people.
No.
It's there for a reason. But what I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, in you choosing this paper today, I think what this paper highlights is that we should hold particularly the government accountable. If they are going to start using algorithmic profiling or AI-powered profiling in anger for their systems, there should be a means for us to understand what that looks like and hold them accountable.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting paper for me because I don't think, again, like stressing, I don't think they've necessarily done anything wrong or bad. It's more the lack of transparency and the feeling that they haven't got it, the impact of it locked down enough. Now, if I take something away from this, is like try not to criminalize people by default. And if you do have to do something like that, don't overreach. The overreach is also quite problematic. And be prepared to be very transparent around things like algorithms, your risk reviews, how you're using data. And I think this is one of the lessons we can take in our own implementations. Is there any other lessons you took from this paper, Leanne?
Well, I think one of the big things to kind of also point out is that because the DWP are so secretive about this, redacting freedom of information requests and sometimes outright refusing freedom of information requests, we're basically dealing with algorithmic secrecy, right? So people are going through profiling systems and the DWP is really marking its own homework. It marks its own home because it's so secretive. When it does the DPIA requests and the EIA requests, it's basically marking its own homework. And when anyone is marking their own homework, then you need to really take those processes with a pinch of salt. Again, no implication that the DWP are doing anything wrong, but they have to understand that in doing so, it erodes public trust. So the big thing for me is it's in marking their own homework and also being that lack of transparency there. It's really impacting people's ability to trust a state in a kind of politically, or and I don't mean just UK, I mean around the world, our whole political system is being shaken by lack of trust. We've got this information like left, right and centre. The last thing we need is a system that's so incredibly vital. It's the heartbeat. That benefit is a heartbeat, a lifeline for so many people. 7.5 million people rely on it, right? And deserve it. That system's there. We live in a country where we don't want to see people go without. We don't want to see people in economic hardship. We want to provide for people. And yet the system it is built on, this algorithmic system that it's built on, raises more questions than it solves problems, in my opinion. From what I can see, the fraud to potential harm ratio doesn't add up for me in this sense.
Well, I think given the current situation, to what you're just saying there, and ideas of things like the digital panopticon, where more and more of our lives will be viewed from a surveillance point of view, and we'll go more into this when we look at some of the other Big Brother watch papers, is you'd think that some of these organisations should welcome external scrutiny, should welcome external review. Think about from like in security pen testing, you don't pen test your own work, you get an external review in, because then you spread the culpability a little bit, the accountability, because you know what, if you found some things and have rectified them, fine. If you found nothing, you've got reputable people in to do it, fine. But just going, no thanks, we'll deal with it.
Yeah, who watches the Watchmen in that case?
But then what happens when something goes wrong? It's all on them. It's all on the people who ran this program then. There's like serious questions on them then.
And that's what this paper suggests, doesn't it? It says, the reason why this paper has come about, it says we just want to make aware because we feel if we don't say something now that there is a massive scandal coming their way. And it'll be the biggest algorithmic scandal this country has ever seen.
Yeah, it's like we had Connected for Health was, I think ended up costing 20 billion. That's not AI, but the point is it was the bigger the program and any failings in it get more and more scrutiny. So this is the biggest AI rollout to date. And what we don't want in the UK public sector is really badly failed AI rollouts, because what will happen is that will have a chilling effect on AI in general in the UK and could cost us dearly. But then also roping the banks of the private sector into this as well. I think the tendrils of the outcomes of this system could have far-reaching damages. So that you'd think they'd want to have more scrutiny and be prepared to explain how they're doing things, and also be more forthcoming with the people who need to use this system or this service over the use of data and profiling, and don't hide behind one of the other criticism levels that sure, it's in our policy, yeah, but it's like subsection 24D in the small print. printed in white ink on white paper or something.
And as we keep saying, you will sign anything if you are
in a hurry. You need it. Yeah.
if you need the cash. You will sign anything if you've not eaten in days, if your children haven't eaten in days, if you are about to be made homeless, if your electric and gas is off, you will sign anything.
It's funny that, isn't it?
There is no opting out of this. If you need that money, which you are entitled to as a member of this country who is legally paid into the system or, has citizenship rights and things like that, you have to opt into this system, which is, and to have no ability to question it is, as we've said time and time again, interesting.
Well, the other thing is, of course, even typically in contract law, I believe contracts signed under duress are challenging anyway. So if you're making that choice under duress and it's disadvantaging you, I don't think it's enough just to say, oh, well, it's in our policy. People's cognitive analysis of things as you mentioned there, under stress isn't great. People need to understand this. Thankfully, there's a load of recommendations off the back of this paper, and I think the ones that people are implementing their own data profiling, their own data, AI systems in, and also the security around them, I think would do well to read to make sure that you stay on the right side of sort of what's good. Because again, they've done nothing wrong technically, but it could all go wrong. So let's not invite that into our own lives and think about how we can make sure we take a more transparent and a better path, in my opinion.
So in a section that is new to this series of compromising positions, I want to call it Armchair Anthropology, which is a derogatory term people throw around to anthropologists when anthropology was first getting started as a discipline. But in this section, I just want to share with you some interesting anthropological theories that apply to this paper. So one of the first things I want to discuss in relation to this paper that you might find interesting in terms of what other theories surround it is a really excellent book by David Lyon. That's Lyon with a Y, and it's called Surveillance as Social Sorting. It came out in 2003. And this research argues that surveillance technologies is not just about catching criminals, but about categorizing populations and managing and governing them differently. So what this sociologist suggests, and it's based on during 9/11 with the no-fly list, is that people use surveillance technologies like algorithms to suggest that people are either risky or part of non-risky groups. And often this is connected to socioeconomic or demographic lines, which means that people get treated differently in terms of those criteria, and therefore their access and their rights diminish. So it's called social sorting and dividing people into groups. And you can kind of see the connection there with what DWP is doing there by socially sorting people who are classed with disability or illness or self-employed or their living circumstances, and suggesting that these people should be classed as risky or non-risky based on that delineation. So it's called social sorting. So that's one for the list there. Another one I wanted to discuss is how the algorithmic gaze begins a reification of categorization. So basically what that means is that there's a suggestion that algorithms tend to rectify or make real categories that might otherwise be fluid or socially constructed. Now, those of you who have been fans of the show know that I go on quite a lot about how people's identity is socially constructed in part by what you've got around you, so you're influenced by your family, the local area where you live, you work and everything like that, and you play parts and roles in that. And what the algorithmic gaze suggests is that algorithms actually make those social constructs real. And so things where you would say like all goth kids are really depressed all the time, that might be stereotypically true, but it's not true of everyone. But algorithms make that assumption real. And if you based things like coded fraudulent patterns on that, then you come into kind of some biased grey area where you're actually amplifying existing stereotypes and then basically penalizing individuals based on group assumptions rather than their own conduct. So it moves people from individual assessments to group-based stereotyping, which you can definitely see might be the case in this paper. And then finally, one thing I wanted to mention was a concept that's been going around for decades and decades. I think it started as a paper in the 1980s by Roger Clarke, and that's dataveillance. So data and surveillance, dataveillance. And the idea behind that is whenever you submit your personal data to a shadowy algorithmic process, there is a precondition that you have to engage with that because the state require it. So what we've been talking about throughout this is like actually there is no opt-in there if it's dataveillance, because in order to be a part of this profiling, you need to do that to get the money you deserve. So dataveillance has been a topic of discussion since the 1980s and definitely one you should check out. And that's the end of Armchair Anthropology for this episode. episode. So, of course, Jeff, this podcast is called Compromising Positions. Now, we're taking it a little bit of a different turn for season 2. What we always ask for people is, who is the compromising position here? But what I mean by it in this episode is, who should really be doing better here? Is it DWP should be doing better with their algorithms? Is it claimants? Are they all committing fraud left, right, and centre? So we need this system in place to be able to tackle that? Or is Big Brother Watch the compromising position here for just putting a spotlight on this, but also maybe pushing too hard to ask for too much to be revealed in terms of this algorithm that potentially, one, can't be revealed because, as we all know, algorithms are a bit of a black box, but also, is there, like DWP say, if they tell us how the sausage is made, then people are going to commit more fraud anyway. So who is the compromising position here?
Well, I mean, the paper ends nicely with a quote to this effect saying, the DWP uses the threat of welfare fraud as a get-out-of-jail-free card to operate in secret, but with machine learning tools allowing for human-like profiling on a large scale, more scrutiny is really needed and not less. And I think absolutely they're the ones implementing this system. I think the users, especially given they've got currently so far not a very good record of accuracy on criminalising by default. And I don't mean actually criminalise as in people getting criminal record. I mean as in presuming guilt and stopping and actually putting roadblocks in before they've done any due process. And also, I think Big Brother Watch certainly should continue asking these questions. In fact, I think it's great that we have an organisation that is entirely tried to be as centrist and as transparent when it's funding and how it processes as possible to ask these questions, because who else is going to ask these questions if the Big Brother Watch won't? Because they've actually got the backing of important and learned people behind them. I mean, we as an industry should be asking these questions as well. I think definitely the DWP really needs to think about how it can respond to this paper before something does happen. And if something catastrophic does happen, then they're going to look really bad. How about you?
I think this paper has massive implications for anyone working in tech. I mean, as you say, the DWP's actions, if it's accurate, or as alleged by Big Brother Watch, serve as a really stark warning. I mean, there's such profound need, not just in this case, but in all cases, for developing ethically responsible AI, right? And we all know that these models are, just by almost default, no matter how hard we try, are riddled with bias because, at some point they were collected by a human being, and human beings are inherently biased. We need bias. Bias is actually a really good thing because it's a social shorthand. It allows us to kind of make connections and think about how we interact with each other and things like that. Some biases are good and obviously quite a lot are bad, but all AI is based on data, and that data is collected by a human being at some point, shaped by a human being at some point, based on human beings, which all act in either stereotypical or non-stereotypical ways. And what I'm saying here is data is always going to be biased, AI is always going to be biased. So the idea that their get out of jail free card is, but there's a human in the loop at some point. The whole process has humans in it. Humans are flawed. And therefore, any process that involves the human is going to be flawed. Now, I'm not advocating that an entirely human-free process is any better, because obviously it goes back to that circular argument. At some point, there's a human that's done all the data collection and data processing and building the algorithm, yada, yada, yada. So we are in a kind of loop there. But one of the kind of things that does highlight is the absolute critical need for transparency and accountability by design. And this paper suggests that is not there. And in all honesty, by the looks of it, they're fighting the good fight. We are not going to get that.
What I can hope is because we currently don't have any proper workable AI regulation, is that actually they will take some of this into account when they actually read it in Parliament, because these are read in many, many settings, is that we'll think about how they can enshrine some of this into AI regulation. So unfortunately, there will be no get out of jail free card for any organisation, be that public or private sector. That's what I'd like, is actually to encode the kind of regulations that don't stop innovation, responsible innovation in the UK, and the usage of AI for our economic and social benefit and progress, but make sure the really bad stuff doesn't get through. Make sure that the stuff that people who are really don't understand the implications of AI get through. Put the safety safety nets in then and make it not an excuse. You say, well, I can't reveal how the sausage is made. Sorry, you will be not compliant if you don't do so. That then is a much easier conversation for even people like Big Brother watch in the future.
Absolutely. And on that note, heavy stuff. Listeners, what did you think of this? Are you going to rush out and read this paper? I suggest you do. It's very interesting, and check out all the other work. This is just one of many papers we'll be bringing to this brand new version of Compromising Positions, where we still ask the same question: am I the compromising position here? But we look at it from lots of different angles, not just the security angle, but how we all fit into this as technologists in this crazy and ever-changing world where, yes, at the end of the day, we are probably the compromising positions here. So thank you so much for joining us. Wherever you're listening to, put comments, leave us a review. It all really helps. It helps us bring the show to you completely and absolutely for free, where we hope to bring you the best quality of academic and white paper research that's coming out in the world of technology, so you can keep not only yourself secure, but also others that you build for. Thank you so much for listening to us, and we will see you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Compromising Positions, the podcast that brings you the latest insights from around the world on cybersecurity, AI, and all things tech. Keep safe, keep secure, remember to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?